In 1905, London was a city driven by trade, precision, and the steady rise of modern industry. Inside a modest office on Cheapside, a young 24-year-old German immigrant named Hans Wilsdorf was building something far larger than the pocket watch import business listed on his paperwork. Wilsdorf believed the pocket watch was reaching the end of its era and that the future belonged to a timepiece worn on the wrist, an idea most experts dismissed as unreliable, impractical, and too fragile for daily use. He ignored them. Instead, he focused on accuracy, durability, and the challenge of miniaturizing a movement without sacrificing precision. Each morning, he sat at his desk reviewing shipments from Swiss suppliers, testing movements with a level of scrutiny that made him an outsider in an industry still clinging to tradition. While competitors argued that wristwatches would never appeal to serious consumers, Wilsdorf quietly pushed forward, refining the tiny mechanisms that would become the core of his company. Behind his consistency was a belief that reliability wasn't a feature, it was the entire identity of a watch. By the end of that year, his tiny London office was no longer just distributing Swiss movements. It was laying the foundation for a brand that would eventually become one of the most recognized names on Earth. What began as an operation run by a young entrepreneur with limited resources was slowly turning into a deliberate pursuit, creating the most accurate wristwatch the world had ever seen.
By 1908, Hans Wilsdorf realized his growing company needed more than precision. It needed a name that carried weight, clarity, and instant recognition across languages and continents. He tested hundreds of possibilities, writing them out, saying them aloud, listening for something sharp and memorable. Eventually, he chose a short, forceful word with no existing meaning: Rolex. It sounded mechanical yet elegant, easy to say in English, German, French, and almost every major language. The decision wasn't creative flair, it was strategy. Wilsdorf knew the global market was expanding, and he wanted a name built for export, not just local sales. As wristwatches gained slow traction among early adopters, he invested heavily in accuracy testing, sending movements to independent observatories normally reserved for marine chronometers. When Rolex became the first wristwatch to earn a Swiss certificate of chronometric precision, it was more than a milestone. It was a challenge to the entire industry. Competitors still claimed wristwatches were toys, fashion pieces, or gimmicks. Wilsdorf countered by proving scientifically that a wristwatch could be as precise as the pocket watches that dominated the market. By now, his company was no longer just selling timepieces, it was reshaping consumer expectations. Every certificate, every advertisement, every improvement reinforced the idea that reliability would always outrank decoration. As London's watch trade grew more crowded, Rolex remained focused on a simple mission: make the most accurate wristwatch in the world and let the results speak for themselves. The foundation for a global empire was forming not through marketing tricks, but through measurable precision that no rival could discredit. By 1914, Wilsdorf's quiet ambition clashed directly with the limits of the watchmaking world. Wristwatches were still treated as delicate accessories, dismissed by most men as unreliable. But Wilsdorf understood that if he wanted to break that perception forever, he needed evidence impossible to ignore. So he did something no wristwatch manufacturer had ever attempted. He submitted a Rolex movement to the Kew Observatory, the same institution that tested naval chronometers used for global navigation. No wristwatch had even come close to passing their standards. Over 45 days, the watch endured temperature changes, positional shifts, and rigorous precision tests. When it was over, the impossible happened. Rolex received a Class A chronometer certificate, an honor previously reserved only for the most advanced marine instruments. Newspapers across Britain reported on the achievement, not because they cared about watches, but because the result challenged a century of assumptions. Suddenly, Rolex wasn't competing with accessory makers. It was competing with scientific tools trusted by navies and explorers. The success forced the entire industry to acknowledge that the wristwatch had evolved from a fragile novelty into a legitimate instrument of accuracy. For Wilsdorf, the certification wasn't just validation, it was a turning point that confirmed his strategy. If Rolex could repeatedly prove itself under the hardest conditions, it would one day dominate the global market. The world was changing, and Rolex was positioning itself to lead that change, not follow it. By 1915, the world was at war, and the wristwatch, once dismissed as a passing trend, was becoming essential equipment on the battlefield. Soldiers couldn't afford the delay of pulling out a pocket watch while coordinating movements, reading signals, or timing artillery. They needed time visible at a glance, durable under mud, shock, and rain. And this shift played directly into Rolex's strengths. Hans Wilsdorf watched the demand rise sharply, but he didn't chase volume for quick profits. Instead, he focused on durability, reinforcing cases, strengthening crystals, and tightening movement tolerances to handle field conditions. British officers began purchasing Rolex watches privately, not as status symbols, but because they performed reliably under stress. Word spread quietly through battalions. The small company with a strange name was producing timepieces capable of surviving the chaos of trench warfare. This wartime necessity accelerated the wristwatch's acceptance more than any advertisement could have, and Rolex became one of the brands trusted when precision mattered most. But while the company grew in reputation, it also faced supply challenges. Wilsdorf relied on Swiss movements, and navigating wartime shipping restrictions became a daily struggle. Still, he refused to compromise quality. Even during a global conflict, Rolex maintained strict standards, reinforcing its reputation not as a luxury maker, but as a supplier of dependable, purpose-built instruments. By the end of the war, the wristwatch had overtaken the pocket watch across the military, and Rolex emerged as one of the brands that proved its worth when reliability meant survival. It was the moment when the company stopped being just another name in the market and became a symbol of trust.
By 1919, the war was over, but Europe was unstable, and London was no longer the ideal base for a company that relied on Swiss components. Hans Wilsdorf made a calculated decision that would define Rolex's future. He relocated the company to Geneva, the global center of fine watchmaking. It wasn't a symbolic move, it was strategic. Geneva offered access to the best craftsmen, stable supply chains, and a reputation that aligned with the precision image Wilsdorf had built for over a decade. From this point forward, every improvement Rolex made was grounded in engineering rather than marketing. In 1926, the company released the Oyster, the world's first commercially successful waterproof wristwatch. Wilsdorf didn't rely on claims, he proved it by placing the watch on the wrist of swimmer Mercedes Gleitze as she attempted to cross the English Channel. When she emerged from the freezing water after hours of swimming, the watch was still functioning perfectly. That single test became a turning point. Rolex wasn't just accurate, it was resilient. The brand shifted from being a maker of precise instruments to a pioneer in durability. 2 years later, the world saw another major innovation, the Oyster Perpetual, the first waterproof self-winding wristwatch with a centrally mounted rotor. It eliminated the need for manual winding and set the blueprint for future automatic watches across the entire industry. This combination of precision, ruggedness, and innovation drove Rolex into a new category. It wasn't just a company making better watches, it was shaping the direction of watchmaking itself. By the early 1930s, Rolex had become synonymous with trust, performance, and innovation, qualities that made it a favorite among explorers, aviators, athletes, and professionals who relied on their equipment daily. The success wasn't sudden or accidental. It was the result of 25 years of Wilsdorf's disciplined approach: prove reliability through real-world tests, never compromise quality, and innovate only when the improvement could be demonstrated, not simply advertised. By the time Rolex entered the mid-20th century, it wasn't just a watch brand. It was a benchmark, a standard, a symbol that precision, when combined with durability, could evolve into something much larger than the sum of its parts. By the 1930s, Rolex had moved far beyond being a promising watchmaker. It was now positioning itself at the center of human achievement, building its reputation through partnerships not with celebrities, but with explorers, aviators, swimmers, scientists, and mountaineers, people who depended on equipment that could not fail. This strategic shift came directly from Wilsdorf's philosophy. A brand earns trust not with words, but with performance under pressure. In 1933, members of the Houston expedition carried Rolex oysters as they flew over Mount Everest, facing extreme winds, violent temperature drops, and low oxygen conditions. The watches survived without losing accuracy, reinforcing the message Rolex had been pushing for years. If the watch could function in the Himalayas, it would function anywhere. During the same era, endurance swimmers, long-distance aviators, and deep-sea divers adopted Rolex because the watches simply worked where others broke. The brand was no longer just producing timekeepers. It was gathering proof that its watches could withstand the harshest environments on Earth. Then came 1945, a milestone year marking the birth of the Datejust, the first self-winding wristwatch with an automatically changing date on the dial. This was more than a convenience feature. It was a demonstration of Rolex's long-term strategy: innovate only when the function adds real, measurable value to everyday life. The Datejust served as a refined counterpart to the rugged Oyster, creating a balance between practical engineering and a luxury identity that hadn't yet been fully defined but was clearly emerging. As Rolex moved into the post-war era, the company strengthened its supply chains, expanded its facilities, and continued to fine-tune its manufacturing processes. Quality control became obsessive. Each movement was checked, adjusted, and tested well beyond industry norms. Rolex was no longer following the trajectory of traditional watchmakers. It was creating its own ecosystem, one where reliability was engineered, not advertised. By the end of the 1940s, Rolex had become a respected international brand, but its peak was still ahead. The next phase, deep-sea exploration, aviation breakthroughs, and the birth of sports models like the Submariner and GMT Master, would transform Rolex from a trusted manufacturer into a cultural icon. What began in a small London office in 1905 had now grown into a global force powered by engineering discipline, real-world testing, and a reputation earned one expedition at a time. Rolex had entered the stage where innovation and identity would merge, shaping the company into the symbol it is today.
By the late 20th century, Rolex had transitioned from a niche innovator to a global benchmark of excellence. The brand's success wasn't accidental. It was the outcome of decades of relentless refinement, precise decision-making, and an unwavering commitment to purpose. As the world entered the 1980s and 1990s, Rolex moved with a sense of clarity that many competitors struggled to match. It didn't chase trends, it defined them. What solidified Rolex's position was its mastery over three levers: engineering reliability, brand discipline, and cultural presence. While other watchmakers spread themselves thin across countless collections and marketing angles, Rolex leaned into a minimal, almost surgical approach. Every model served a functional role, every update carried intention, and every marketing move reinforced the message that a Rolex wasn't simply purchased, it was earned. This level of brand consistency created a halo effect that few companies in any industry achieve. Internally, Rolex continued investing heavily in vertical integration. The company brought more processes in-house: movements, cases, bracelets, alloys. Even the foundry that created Rolex's proprietary metals became part of the core ecosystem. With this structure, Rolex ensured that no external weakness could compromise the integrity of its products. It was a strategy rooted in long-term thinking, slow, steady, deeply methodical, and it paid off.
Culturally, Rolex watches became universal indicators of achievement. They appeared in boardrooms, on expedition summits, in championship sports, and on the wrists of scientists, divers, and entrepreneurs. A Rolex wasn't marketed as luxury for luxury's sake. Instead, it was positioned as a tool worn by people who pushed limits. Over time, this narrative created a psychological bridge. If you succeeded, you wore a Rolex. If you wore a Rolex, people assumed you were someone who succeeded. Very few brands ever build such feedback loops. Rolex perfected it. By the early 2000s, the brand's momentum had become self-reinforcing. Demand began outpacing supply by entire magnitudes. Waiting lists grew. Pre-owned values climbed. Collectors, new buyers, and longtime enthusiasts all competed for the same limited production output. Rolex maintained discipline. No dramatic increase in manufacturing, no shortcuts in materials, no attempt at mass-market expansion. This restraint became the cornerstone of the company's aura. The modern era only accelerated this trajectory. As digital culture amplified signals and social proof spread globally, Rolex remained the reference point for precision, durability, and status. Competitors innovated aggressively, but Rolex never shifted from its North Star. It advanced quietly, methodically, with improvements so refined you often needed a loupe to detect them. In a world obsessed with rapid cycles, Rolex's slow rhythm became its competitive advantage. Today, Rolex stands as one of the most recognized and trusted brands on the planet, not just in watches, but across all luxury categories. Its success is the cumulative outcome of more than 1 century of disciplined vision. A founder who challenged the norms of his era, a company that prioritized engineering over hype, and a philosophy that treated time not as a commodity, but as a responsibility. The result is a legacy unmatched. Rolex didn't simply win the watchmaking race, it redesigned the track, set the pace, and continues to define what enduring excellence looks like.